Well, I think Austen is a really good writer to think through these questions with. I mean, Jane Austen is so often referred to or thought about as a novelist of home, a novelist of leisure. In other words, all sorts of things that aren't always thought of as work. And I think it's worth interrogating that and contesting that really, really strongly for a bunch of reasons. I guess one of the main reasons why I think she's so helpful to us is that it's really clear that questions of work and questions of value have always been connected. So women's work is often, historically, and one could say still to a certain extent, not always valued in ways that stand up to rigorous kinds of scrutiny. So we can think about this in a literary sense. We can think about what literary works, like what novels, for instance, get valued and what don't get valued. We can think about how, okay, if we haven't thought, or not many of us have been thinking about the relationship between women writers and other kinds of work that they're doing. What does that say about how we value literary work as opposed to other kinds of work, whether that's paid work as a teacher, whether it's working in a shop, whether it's working as an artist, whether it's unpaid, leisured, in quotation marks, craft work, whether it's the work of caregiving or running a household. Why haven't we valued that in those kinds of ways? One of the things I think is really interesting about Austen is that she's a writer, of course, whose value has rarely been under the same kind of doubt as many of her contemporaries and predecessors. Like, we've always read Jane Austen, and she's always had her detractors, but she's always had her fans right from the get-go. So so her work has been valued uniquely. And partly there has historically, I think, been a narrative that the reason why she's been uniquely valued in that ways is because her work is qualitatively better. And I think lots of us would agree that she does write richer, more nuanced, formally more adept novels than many of her contemporaries and many of her successors. But the way that we've sort of valued work in her writing has, I think, been somewhat distorted by her canonical kind of reception, and actually, and led many to think that, well, one of the reasons why we value her also is because she's really not interested in these grubby worlds of economics and these grubby worlds of work that some of her contemporaries are in. She's not. Yes, she is writing for money, but she's not, and she's financially independent, but she's not churning out novels at the rate that some of her contemporaries are, because they're going from one sale of copyright to another simply to feed their families. And therefore she can, in a sense, can afford to be a kind of better writer than her contemporaries. If you look at Austen's fiction, one of the things it seems to me is that she's deeply, deeply committed to thinking about the complexity of women's work. Okay, none of her characters face kind of fall into labour as they do in some other kind of novelists of the time. The closest we get is Jane Fairfax in Emma, where she's having to face the horror of horrors of being a governess and decides that marrying Frank Churchill is better. I mean, who knows really, but it depends what you think about Frank Churchill. I have my own views on that. So we don't really see sort of labouring characters as such, really. There are lots of servants, of course, many of whom are named actually, but few of whom get their own stories. So she doesn't have many labouring characters in her novel, but she's deeply preoccupied with the question and value of women's work. And of course, that's absolutely tied for Austen, it seems to me, with the work of the novel. I mean, when she has that fantastic vindication of the novel in Northanger Abbey in chapter 5, she talks about the undervalued labours of the novelist. She's talking about writing as work in a way that we find echoes and parallels in her letters, where she talks about the pressures under which she was writing, even though she wasn't producing novels and to sort of support her family in the way that some of her contemporaries were doing. So I think she's a really, really interesting figure to think about in relation to these debates, because in a sense, we can talk about her in a way that isn't encumbered by some of the baggage that comes with some of the other women writers who are writing to feed their children or so forth. We take her value as a given, usually. And because we value her work, it enables us to assess how she's valuing work in ways that I think are really, really, really helpful and helpfully untethered from some of that baggage that we take with other of the writers of the time.